The laughter started as soon as Daniel Brooks stepped into the conference room with his cleaning cart. "Oh, perfect," Rebecca Hayes smirked, not bothering to lower her voice. "Maybe the janitor can solve our translation problem, too." Her colleagues joined in the cruel amusement, a grown man reduced to mopping floors while they sealed million-dollar deals. The Russian client shifted uncomfortably as Rebecca waved the Cyrillic documents in frustration. "This contract could make or break us, and we can't find a single translator in all of Manhattan." The mockery grew louder when someone joked about Daniel's extensive education in bathroom maintenance. But when Rebecca finally snapped, "I'd give my entire salary to anyone who could actually translate this mess," the room fell silent. The man they'd been ridiculing quietly set down his mop and walked toward the table. "I'll take that bet," Daniel said calmly. The fluorescent lights of Whitmore and Associates hummed their familiar tune at 10:30 on a Tuesday evening. Daniel Brooks had grown used to the sound over 3 years of night shifts, the way it mixed with the distant hum of traffic 27 floors below Manhattan's legal district. His reflection caught in the polished elevator doors as he descended from the executive floors, a man in his mid-40s with calloused hands and tired eyes, wearing the Navy uniform that made him invisible to the lawyers who worked these halls during daylight hours. The building emptied earlier than usual tonight, leaving behind the remnants of ambition and expensive coffee. Daniel's routine never changed. Start on the top floor, work his way down, empty trash bins, vacuum carpets, polish surfaces that gleamed under lights that never truly went dark in a city that never slept. He'd perfected the art of existing without being seen, moving through spaces like a ghost who left everything cleaner than he found it. His daughter Emma had texted him during his dinner break a photo of her latest painting, a watercolor of Central Park in autumn that somehow captured more hope than her 12-year-old hands should have been able to manage. The medical bills from her rare genetic condition sat folded in his wallet, like a constant reminder of why he pushed through 18-hour days between his cleaning job and weekend construction work. The numbers never seemed to get smaller, only more urgent as her treatments became more complex. Daniel had learned to measure time differently than the lawyers who hurried past him. They counted in billable hours and quarterly profits. He counted in Emma's good days versus bad days, in insurance deductibles and prescription refills, in the careful mathematics of survival that required every paycheck to stretch further than it wanted to go. Tonight felt no different from the hundreds that came before it, until he wheeled his cart into the main conference room and found it wasn't empty. The voices hit him first. Sharp, frustrated, tinged with the kind of panic that expensive suits couldn't hide. Rebecca Hayes stood at the head of the mahogany table, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light as she gestured at documents spread before her like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. She was younger than Daniel by at least 15 years, with the confidence that came from never doubting that doors would open when she knocked on them. 3 other associates flanked her: James Morrison with his Harvard tie pin that he wore like a badge of honor, Sarah Kim, whose family connections had smoothed her path to partnership track, and Michael Torres, whose bilingual skills had proven useful until tonight. The Russian client, a heavy-set man in an expensive overcoat, paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city's glittering arteries. Daniel had seen this scene before in different variations. Late-night crises that required all hands on deck, problems that couldn't wait for morning, deals that hung in the balance while smart people discovered the limits of their expertise. He'd learned to read the temperature of these situations, to gauge whether his presence would be tolerated or if he should return later when the storm had passed. But something about tonight felt different. The tension had weight to it, the kind that suggested more than professional inconvenience. The Russian documents scattered across the table caught the light, their Cyrillic letters forming patterns that seemed to mock the assembled legal minds who couldn't decipher them. Daniel moved quietly around the room's perimeter, emptying wastebasks and straightening chairs with the practiced efficiency that made him invisible. He'd mastered the art of selective hearing, knowing when to listen and when to let conversations flow past him like background noise. But tonight, the fragments he caught suggested something bigger than a standard contract review. The Russian client's nervous energy filled the room like static electricity. His accent was thick, but his English clear when he spoke. "Time is not luxury we have. My associates in Moscow, they expect resolution before market opens. If translation is not accurate." He left the sentence hanging like a threat wrapped in diplomatic language. Rebecca's frustration manifested in small ways, the way she tapped her pen against the table's surface, how she kept pushing her hair behind her ear only to have it fall forward again, the slight tremor in her voice, when she assured their client that they would find a solution. Daniel had observed enough high-pressure situations to recognize when confidence was performing against fear. The firm's usual translator was unreachable, trapped somewhere between connecting flights and international time zones. The backup service they'd contacted had quoted 48 hours for technical legal documents, time they didn't have. Every minute that passed felt like money slipping through fingers that couldn't quite close fast enough to hold on to it. Daniel finished cleaning the far end of the room and began working his way closer to the table where the crisis unfolded. The documents were spread out like a map to treasure that no one present could read. He caught glimpses of the Cyrillic text, formal, dense, the kind of legal language that required more than basic fluency to navigate properly. It was James Morrison who first noticed Daniel's presence with anything approaching acknowledgement. "Excuse me," he said with the casual dismissal that came naturally to men who'd never doubted their place in the world's hierarchy. "We're dealing with some sensitive materials here. Maybe you could come back later?" The suggestion hung in the air for a moment before Rebecca's exasperation boiled over. "No, it's fine. He's just cleaning. It's not like he can read Russian anyway." She laughed, but it was sharp rather than amused. Hell, at this point I'd take anyone who could make sense of this mess. The comment landed with unintended weight. Daniel paused in his work, his hands stilling on the cloth he'd been using to polish the table's surface. The lawyers continued their discussion, treating him like furniture that happened to overhear their conversation. Sarah Kim leaned forward, studying the documents with the intensity of someone trying to will comprehension into existence. "The client says it's some kind of joint venture agreement, but there are clauses here that don't match the preliminary terms we discussed. Without knowing exactly what we're looking at, we're flying blind," Michael finished. "And if we advise him to sign something that isn't what he thinks it is, we're looking at malpractice suits that could shut us down." The Russian client's patience was wearing thin. His pacing had become more agitated, and he kept checking his phone with the frequency of a man watching critical time slip away. "In my country, when lawyers cannot read documents, they are not lawyers. They are, how do you say, pretenders." The insult stung, but it was Rebecca who absorbed it with the grace of someone accustomed to proving herself in rooms full of doubt. "Mr. Volkov, I assure you we're doing everything possible to resolve this. Our firm has handled complex international agreements for over 60 years. This is just a temporary setback." But Volkov wasn't buying diplomatic reassurance. Temporary setbacks cost permanent money. "My associates, they do not accept excuses. Results only." Daniel continued his work, but he found himself studying the documents more carefully as he moved around the table. The Cyrillic letters formed familiar patterns, awakening pathways in his mind that had been dormant but never forgotten. His hands moved automatically through the motions of cleaning while his brain began processing something else entirely. The conversation continued around him, growing more desperate as each potential solution crumbled under scrutiny. Emergency translation services were either unavailable, too expensive, or couldn't guarantee accuracy for technical legal terminology. The clock on the conference room wall showed nearly 11, and time zones across the globe meant that their window for resolution was shrinking rapidly. It was during this crescendo of professional panic that Rebecca's composure finally cracked completely. The pressure of the situation, combined with the weight of what failure might mean for her career, broke through the careful control she'd maintained all evening. "This is insane," she declared, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who'd reached the end of her rope. "We've got a $50 million deal hanging in the balance, and we can't find anyone in all of New York City who can tell us what these documents actually say." She stood up abruptly, pacing behind her chair with quick, agitated steps. "I mean, what are we supposed to do? Call every Russian restaurant in Manhattan and ask if their waiters can translate legal contracts?" The joke fell flat in the tense atmosphere, but it seemed to unleash something in Rebecca that had been building all evening. "You know what? At this point, I don't care who does it. I'd give my entire salary to anyone who could actually make sense of this mess." The declaration hung in the air like a challenge that no one present could meet. The other lawyers exchanged glances that communicated their shared helplessness. Volkov stopped pacing and fixed Rebecca with a look that suggested he was reevaluating his choice of legal representation. In the silence that followed, Daniel set down his cleaning cloth. The movement was quiet, but it somehow drew everyone's attention. He looked up from the table he'd been polishing, meeting Rebecca's eyes directly for the first time since he'd entered the room. "I'll take that bet," he said, his voice calm and steady in the charged atmosphere. The response was immediate and predictable. James Morrison let out a bark of laughter that was more surprised than amused. Oh, this is rich. The janitor thinks he can. But Daniel was already moving toward the documents, his focus entirely on the Cyrillic text that spread across multiple pages like a puzzle waiting to be solved. He didn't ask permission or wait for invitation. He simply began to read. The room fell silent as Daniel's eyes moved across the text with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood not just the language, but the legal concepts being expressed in it. His lips moved slightly as he processed the more complex passages, translating not just words but meaning, context, implication. Rebecca was the first to realize that something extraordinary was happening. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you actually?" Daniel looked up from the documents, his expression serious. "This isn't a joint venture agreement," he said quietly. "It's a shell company formation document designed to launder money through a series of offshore accounts. The preliminary terms you discussed were never intended to be the final agreement. This document would make your client liable for tax evasion in at least 3 countries." The silence that followed was profound. Volkov had stopped moving entirely, his face a careful mask that revealed nothing. The lawyers stared at Daniel as if he'd just performed an impossible magic trick that they couldn't begin to explain. Rebecca found her voice first. "How could you possibly know that?" Daniel's response was interrupted by Volkov, who had moved closer to the table. "He is lying," the Russian said, but his tone lacked conviction. "How can cleaning man read legal Russian?" "Because," Daniel said, looking directly at Volkov, "I know exactly what you're trying to do here, and I know why you chose a firm young enough and ambitious enough to not ask the right questions." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Volkov's carefully maintained composure began to crack, revealing something harder underneath. Rebecca looked between Daniel and her client, trying to process information that didn't fit her understanding of the world. "I don't understand what's happening here." "What's happening," Daniel said, his voice gaining strength, "is that you are about to become unwitting accomplices in a money laundering operation that would have destroyed your careers and possibly landed you in federal prison." He picked up one of the documents and pointed to a specific clause. "This section here establishes your firm as the fiduciary agent for funds that will be cycled through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and Delaware." The language is deliberately obscure, but the effect is clear. "Any money that passes through these accounts becomes legally clean, and your signatures on this agreement make you responsible for reporting it as legitimate business income." The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She sank into her chair, her face pale, but the preliminary discussions, the due diligence reports, were all carefully crafted to present a legitimate business opportunity, Daniel continued. "Mr. Volkov here is quite skilled at finding ambitious law firms that are hungry enough for big clients to skip the deeper background checks that might reveal inconvenient truths." Volkov's facade finally crumbled completely. The nervous energy that had seemed like anxiety over a complex deal revealed itself as something else entirely, the tension of a man whose carefully laid plans were unraveling in real time. "You have no proof of these accusations," Volkov said, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. Daniel smiled grimly. "Actually, I do, because this isn't the first time you've tried this particular scheme. The shell company names are variations on ones that were investigated by the Treasury Department 2 years ago in connection with a similar operation in Chicago. The investigators couldn't make charges stick because the lawyers involved claimed ignorance of their clients' true intentions." The room had become a tableau of stunned silence. Sarah Kim looked like she might be sick. James Morrison's Harvard confidence had evaporated entirely. Michael Torres was frantically taking notes as if documenting evidence for a case that was building itself around them. Rebecca was the first to find her voice. "How do you know all this?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth the situation could bear. "Because," he said finally, "before I started cleaning these offices, I spent 15 years teaching comparative linguistics and international law at Columbia University. I specialized in cross-cultural legal frameworks and the linguistic patterns that criminal organizations use to hide their activities in legitimate business documents." The revelation landed like a bomb in the conference room's carefully controlled atmosphere. Rebecca stared at Daniel as if seeing him for the first time, trying to reconcile the man in the custodial uniform with the expertise he'd just demonstrated. "That's impossible," James Morrison said weakly. "If you were a professor at Columbia, what are you doing?" He gestured at the cleaning cart, unable to finish the sentence. Daniel's expression softened slightly, revealing a depth of pain that his professional composure had been hiding. Sometimes life forces you to make choices that don't appear in any textbook, he said. My daughter has a rare genetic condition that requires specialized treatment not covered by university insurance. The medical bills were destroying us, and Columbia couldn't offer the flexibility I needed to manage her care schedule. He paused, his hands resting on the documents that had changed everything. Cleaning offices at night pays more than adjunct teaching, and the schedule allows me to be available during the day when Emma needs me. It's honest work, and it keeps food on the table and medicine in the cabinet. The room absorbed this information in silence. Rebecca's earlier mockery now hung in the air like a toxic cloud that no one wanted to acknowledge directly. The casual cruelty of her assumptions about Daniel's intelligence and worth had been exposed as both wrong and deeply unfair. But the immediate crisis still demanded resolution. Volkov remained in the room, his scheme exposed but his presence still threatening. The documents on the table were evidence of attempted fraud, but they also represented a moment of decision for everyone present. "What do we do now?" Sarah Kim asked quietly. Daniel looked around the room, his gaze settling on each person present before returning to Rebecca. "That depends on what kind of lawyers you want to be," he said. "You can pretend this never happened, refuse the case, and hope Volkov doesn't try to retaliate for the inconvenience. Or you can do the right thing and report this to the appropriate authorities. If we report it," Michael said slowly, "we become witnesses in a federal investigation. That could take months to resolve, and there's no guarantee we won't face scrutiny ourselves for how close we came to being involved." "If you don't report it," Daniel countered, "Volkov simply takes his scheme to another firm. Maybe one that's less fortunate than you were tonight. Maybe one that doesn't happen to have someone around who can read the fine print in Russian." Rebecca had been quiet through this exchange, processing not just the immediate situation but the larger implications of everything that had transpired. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, less certain, more thoughtful. "Mr. Volkov," she said, turning to face her would-be client directly, "I think it's time for you to leave our offices. We won't be requiring your services, and I suggest you consider whether continuing to pursue this particular business model is in your best interests." Volkov's expression hardened, but he was clearly calculating his options. Exposed schemes rarely improved with prolonged exposure, and his best chance lay in retreat and regrouping rather than escalation. "You are making a mistake," he said, but the threat felt hollow. "My associates will not forget this disrespect." "Your associates," Daniel said calmly, "are welcome to explain their concerns to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I'm sure they'd be very interested in discussing the offshore accounts and shell companies mentioned in these documents." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats before Volkov moved toward the door. His departure was swift and silent, leaving behind only the echo of expensive shoes on marble flooring and the faint scent of cologne that couldn't quite mask the smell of fear. In the silence that followed, the 4 lawyers and 1 custodian stood around the conference table that had become the center of a drama none of them had anticipated. The documents that had seemed so crucial moments before now felt like evidence of a bullet dodged rather than a treasure lost. Rebecca was the first to break the silence. "I owe you an apology," she said to Daniel. "More than one, actually. What I said earlier, the way I treated you, it was inexcusable." Daniel nodded acknowledgement but didn't rush to offer forgiveness. The wounds of casual disrespect ran deeper than quick apologies could heal, and everyone present needed to sit with the discomfort of recognizing how wrong they'd been. "The question now," James Morrison said carefully, "is what happens next. Do we report this to the authorities?" "We report it," Rebecca said with newfound certainty. "Daniel's right. If we don't, we're just passing the problem to someone else who might not be as lucky as we were tonight." Sarah Kim looked at Daniel with something approaching awe. "How did you spot it so quickly? I mean, the rest of us were looking at those documents for hours without seeing the deception." Daniel managed a tired smile. "Criminal organizations are surprisingly predictable once you know their patterns. They use the same linguistic tricks, the same misdirection techniques, the same legal structures with minor variations. It's like recognizing a song played in a different key. The melody might sound different, but the underlying structure remains the same." He gathered the documents into a neat stack, his movements careful and respectful of evidence that would soon be crucial to a federal investigation. The hardest part for most people is recognizing that complexity doesn't necessarily mean legitimacy. Criminals often hide behind elaborate language and convoluted structures, betting that their victims won't have the time or expertise to untangle the deception. Michael Torres had been taking notes throughout the conversation, and now he looked up with a question that everyone had been thinking, but no one had asked. What happens to you now? I mean, this is going to become a federal case. You'll be a key witness. Won't that make continuing to work here complicated? The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Daniel's employment at Whitmore and Associates had never been more than a means to an end, but it was also his primary source of income and health insurance. The medical bills that had driven him from academia to janitorial work hadn't disappeared, and Emma's treatment schedule remained as demanding as ever. Rebecca was staring at Daniel with an expression that suggested she was working through calculations that went beyond simple mathematics. You know, she said slowly, our firm could use someone with your expertise on a more permanent basis. We handle a lot of international contracts, and having someone who can spot potential problems before they become actual problems would be valuable. The offer surprised everyone present, Daniel included. He'd been preparing himself for the likelihood that his whistleblowing would cost him his job, not create new opportunities within it. I don't have an active law license, he said carefully, and my teaching credentials are 15 years out of date. We're not talking about bringing you on as an attorney, Rebecca clarified, but as a consultant, someone who can review contracts, identify potential issues, provide cultural and linguistic context that our regular staff might miss. The pay would be significantly better than custodial work, and the hours could be more flexible to accommodate your daughter's needs. James Morrison looked skeptical. The partners would have to approve any new consultant positions. And after tonight's near disaster, they might be gun-shy about anything that seems irregular. After tonight's near disaster, Rebecca countered, they'll be very interested in anything that prevents future near disasters. Daniel just saved us from a malpractice suit that could have destroyed the firm. I think they'll be willing to listen to creative staffing solutions. Daniel felt the weight of possibility pressing against years of carefully managed expectations. The opportunity Rebecca was describing represented more than just better pay and more suitable work. It offered a chance to use his education and experience in service of something meaningful again. But possibility had disappointed him before, and he'd learned to be cautious about offers that seemed too good to be true. I'd need to think about it, he said, and we'd need to get through the federal investigation first. This isn't going to be simple or quick to resolve. Of course, Rebecca agreed. But I want you to know the offer is genuine. What you did tonight, it wasn't just about translating documents. You saw patterns that the rest of us missed, identified risks that could have destroyed careers and lives. That kind of insight is rare, and it's exactly what firms like ours need to navigate increasingly complex international business. The conversation was interrupted by Daniel's phone buzzing with a text message. He glanced at the screen and saw Emma's name, along with a photo of her latest art project, a drawing of a man in work clothes standing next to a much taller building, both figures rendered in the hopeful primary colors that seemed to be her signature style. I should head home, Daniel said, pocketing the phone. My daughter stays up too late worrying when I'm not back by midnight. As he moved toward his cleaning cart, Rebecca called out to him. Daniel? When he turned back, she continued, Thank you for everything. I know we don't deserve your help after how we treated you, but I'm grateful you gave it anyway. Daniel paused, considering his response. Everyone deserves a second chance to do the right thing, he said finally. Tonight, you got yours. What you do with it is up to you. He left the conference room with his cart and his dignity intact, but also with something he hadn't possessed when he'd entered the knowledge that his expertise still had value beyond the narrow confines he'd been forced to accept. The elevator carried him down through the building's floors, past the offices where tomorrow's crises were already taking shape, toward the street level where Emma's artwork waited on his phone screen like a reminder that hope sometimes manifested in unexpected colors. 27 floors above, 4 lawyers sat around a conference table covered with evidence of a crime that had been prevented by knowledge disguised as invisibility. The documents would be turned over to federal authorities in the morning, beginning a process that would eventually see Volkov and his associates face justice for their attempted fraud. But the more immediate transformation had already begun in the minds of people who had learned to see differently, to value expertise regardless of the uniform that contained it, and to recognize that wisdom sometimes appeared in forms that challenged every assumption about worth and capability. The building's night shift continued around them, invisible hands maintaining the spaces where visible people made decisions that shaped the world. And somewhere in that ecosystem of overlapping responsibilities and hidden competencies, new possibilities were taking shape, possibilities that might allow a man's knowledge to match his needs, and a daughter's hope to find expression in colors that reached beyond the boundaries of what seemed realistic or achievable. The clock on the conference room wall showed nearly midnight, but for the first time in months, morning felt like it might bring something more than just another day of carefully managed survival. Sometimes change arrived in the voice of someone who had been speaking all along, waiting only for someone willing to listen rather than merely hear. The next morning arrived with the kind of autumn clarity that made Manhattan's chaos seem almost purposeful. Daniel had barely slept, his mind cycling through the previous evening's events like a record with a skip that kept returning to the same impossible moment. Emma had been waiting up when he got home, curled on the couch with a book about marine biology that was probably too advanced for her age but perfectly suited to her curiosity. "How was work, Dad?" she'd asked with the careful attention that children develop when they learn to read the subtle signs of their parents' emotional weather. "Different," he'd answered, which was both true and completely inadequate. How could he explain that everything had changed in the space of a few hours? That the invisible boundaries of his world had suddenly expanded in ways he was still trying to understand? Now, sitting at their small kitchen table while Emma ate cereal and prepared for another day of 7th grade, Daniel found himself staring at his phone. The contact information for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division was already pulled up in his browser, waiting for him to make the call that would officially set wheels in motion. Emma noticed his distraction. "You're thinking really hard about something," she observed with the directness that made her both wonderful and occasionally uncomfortable to be around. "Good thinking or worried thinking?" "Maybe both," Daniel admitted. "Sometimes the right thing to do is also the complicated thing to do." She nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to someone who had spent most of her life navigating the complicated intersection of childhood and chronic illness. "Like when I have to miss school for treatments but I don't want to fall behind in science class?" Exactly like that. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes we have to choose the harder path because it leads somewhere better." After Emma left for school, Daniel sat alone in their apartment and made the call. The FBI agent who took his information was professional, but clearly interested in the details of Volkov's scheme. An appointment was scheduled for that afternoon, and Daniel was advised to bring any documentation he could provide. By the time he arrived at Whitmore and Associates that evening, word had apparently spread about the previous night's events. The security guard at the front desk nodded to him with something approaching respect, and the elevator operator, a man named Carlos who had worked nights in the building for over a decade, actually spoke to him for the first time. "Heard you helped some folks out of a tight spot," Carlos said as the elevator climbed toward the executive floors. "Just did what anyone would do," Daniel replied, though he wasn't sure that was true. "Nah, man, not anyone. Takes something special to step up when it matters." The conference room where everything had changed was empty when Daniel arrived, but Rebecca Hayes was waiting in her office down the hall. She looked up when he knocked on her doorframe, and he could see that she'd been thinking as hard as he had. "I wasn't sure you'd come in tonight," she said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I called the FBI this morning," Daniel said without preamble. "They want to meet with me tomorrow afternoon to go over everything in detail." Rebecca nodded as if she'd been expecting this. "I called them too. This morning, right after I spoke with the partners about what happened. We're going to cooperate fully with whatever investigation follows." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Outside Rebecca's office windows, Manhattan stretched away in all directions, full of people making choices that would ripple outward in ways they couldn't predict. "I spoke with the senior partners about the consulting position I mentioned last night," Rebecca said eventually. "They're very interested in discussing it with you once the federal investigation concludes. The pay would be $60,000 a year to start, with full benefits and a flexible schedule that could accommodate your daughter's needs." The number hit Daniel like a physical force. It was nearly double what he made from his combined cleaning and construction work, and the benefits alone would transform Emma's treatment from a constant financial crisis into something manageable. "That's generous," he said carefully. "But I need to understand what you'd expect in return." "Exactly what you did last night. Review international contracts, identify potential legal and cultural issues, provide expertise that helps us serve our clients better, and avoid situations like the one with Volkov. You'd essentially be our early warning system for deals that seem too good to be true." Daniel found himself thinking about Emma's artwork, about the way she painted buildings that reached toward the sky with optimistic determination. Maybe hope wasn't just about primary colors and impossible dreams. Maybe sometimes it looked like practical opportunities that could support the dreams that mattered most. I'd want to maintain some of my current cleaning responsibilities, he said, surprising himself with the statement. Rebecca looked puzzled. Why would you want to do that? Because this building has a lot of conversations happening after hours, when people think no one important is listening. If I'm going to be effective at spotting problems before they become disasters, I need to understand the full context of how business gets done here. It was a practical consideration, but it was also something more. The night cleaning job had taught him lessons about invisibility and observation that his academic career never could have provided. Those skills had proved valuable last night, and they might prove valuable again. Rebecca smiled for the first time since he'd known her. You know, I think that's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of around here. 3 weeks later, Daniel found himself in circumstances that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. The FBI investigation had moved forward with the methodical precision of federal bureaucracy, and Volkov had been arrested attempting to board a flight to Moscow with a suitcase full of cash and a passport that raised interesting questions about his actual identity. The story had made the business pages of several newspapers, though Daniel's name was carefully kept out of the coverage at his request. Whitmore and Associates was praised for their cooperation with authorities and their decisive action in preventing a significant fraud. Rebecca Hayes was quoted as saying that the firm's commitment to ethical practice had guided their decision to report the scheme rather than simply declining to participate. Daniel's new office was small but functional, with a window that offered a slice of view towards Central Park. His official title was Senior Consultant for International Affairs, though most people in the building simply knew him as the man who had prevented a disaster that could have destroyed careers and lives. Emma had adapted to the changes with the resilience that children often display when life takes unexpected turns for the better. Her medical treatments continued, but the constant anxiety about insurance coverage and co-payments had lifted like fog clearing on a summer morning. She'd started taking art classes at a community center near their apartment, and her latest paintings showed new confidence in their composition and color choices. The cleaning job continued 3 nights a week, partly for practical reasons and partly because Daniel had discovered something valuable in the dual perspective it provided. Days spent reviewing contracts and analyzing international business deals gave him insights that proved useful during evening hours when he overheard casual conversations that revealed the human motivations behind legal documents. It was during one of these evening shifts that he encountered James Morrison in the break room, making coffee at nearly 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. The younger lawyer looked up when Daniel entered, and their eyes met with the complicated recognition that comes from shared experience of dramatic change. "Working late?" Daniel asked, though the answer was obvious. "Partnership review is next month," James replied. "Trying to make sure my caseload is as strong as possible." They stood in the break room's fluorescent light, 2 men whose relationship had been fundamentally altered by events neither had anticipated. The easy dismissal that had characterized James's initial attitude toward Daniel had been replaced by something more complex respect, mixed with a kind of embarrassment that suggested ongoing internal reckoning. "Can I ask you something?" James said eventually. "That night with Volkov, you said you recognized patterns from previous criminal schemes. How many cases like that have you encountered?" Daniel poured himself coffee from the machine that maintenance staff weren't technically supposed to use, but that no one had ever told him to avoid. "More than you might expect," he said. "Academic conferences, consulting work, research projects that brought me into contact with international business practices. Criminal organizations are surprisingly consistent in their methods once you learn to recognize the signs. Why didn't you ever go into law enforcement? With that kind of expertise, you could have had a career with the FBI or Treasury Department." It was a reasonable question, but it touched on choices and circumstances that weren't easily explained to someone who had followed a more traditional path from privilege to profession. "Life rarely unfolds according to the plans we make in graduate school," Daniel said diplomatically. James nodded as if this answer contained depths he was still learning to fathom. "The partners have been talking about expanding the international division. Word is they're impressed with the insights you've been providing on the European contracts." "I enjoy the work," Daniel said, which was true in ways he hadn't expected. Using his expertise to help clients navigate complex legal frameworks felt like a return to the intellectual engagement he'd missed during his years of purely physical labor. "Rebecca's been saying that having you review contracts before they go to clients has already prevented 2 other potential problems this month. Nothing as dramatic as the Volkov situation, but issues that could have caused complications down the road." Daniel had indeed identified language in a German acquisition agreement that would have created unexpected tax liabilities and flagged potential cultural misunderstandings in a contract with a Chinese manufacturing company. The work was satisfying in ways that went beyond financial compensation. It felt like using knowledge in service of something constructive rather than merely theoretical. Their conversation was interrupted by Rebecca herself, who appeared in the break room doorway with the slightly frazzled look of someone who had been working through dinner and was now considering working through midnight as well. "Perfect," she said when she saw both men. "I was hoping I might find you here, Daniel. We just received a contract proposal from a mining consortium in Kazakhstan, and some of the language is setting off alarm bells. Would you have time to take a look at it tonight?" Daniel checked his watch and calculated the remaining tasks on his cleaning schedule against the urgency in Rebecca's voice. "Give me an hour to finish the executive conference rooms, then I can review whatever you've got." "Thank you," Rebecca said with genuine relief. "The client meeting is scheduled for 9 tomorrow morning, and I'd rather know what we're walking into before we sit down at the table." As she hurried back toward her office, James lingered in the break room, studying Daniel with an expression that suggested ongoing fascination with the complexities of human circumstance. "It must be strange," James said eventually, going from professor to janitor to consultant. "Like living several different lives in the space of a few years." Daniel considered the observation while finishing his coffee. "I think maybe we all live several different lives," he said. "Most of us just don't get forced to acknowledge the transitions as dramatically as I have." An hour later, Daniel sat in Rebecca's office reviewing documents that were indeed concerning, though in ways that were more subtle than Volkov's crude money laundering scheme. The Kazakh mining consortium was legitimate, but their proposal contained provisions that would essentially make Whitmore and Associates responsible for environmental compliance in a region where such compliance was difficult to verify and expensive to maintain. "It's not fraudulent," Daniel explained as Rebecca took notes on his analysis, "but it's structured to shift liability in ways that your clients probably don't fully understand. If environmental problems emerge later, the consortium can point to these clauses and argue that the American partners were responsible for oversight they couldn't practically provide." Rebecca looked up from her notes with the expression of someone who was beginning to recognize patterns in international business that she'd never been trained to see. "So we'd be advising our clients to accept responsibility for problems they can't control in countries they don't understand?" "Essentially, yes. The financial returns look attractive on paper, but the risk exposure is much higher than the initial presentation suggests." It was nearly midnight when they finished reviewing the contracts and preparing recommendations for the morning meeting. As Daniel gathered his cleaning supplies to complete his evening rounds, Rebecca called out to him from her desk. "You know, 6 months ago, I would have advised our clients to sign that Kazakhstan deal without thinking twice about the environmental clauses. I would have seen the financial projections and the legal language and assumed that our due diligence was complete." Daniel paused in the doorway, understanding that she was working through thoughts that went beyond the immediate business situation. "Knowledge isn't just about what you learned in school," he said. "It's about understanding how different kinds of experience connect to create insight. Tonight's contract review was only possible because I've seen how criminal organizations hide risk in complex language, how environmental regulations work in countries with developing legal systems, and how financial projections can be structured to obscure long-term liabilities." "And you learn those things by living several different lives," Rebecca said, using James's phrase from earlier in the evening. "I learned those things by paying attention to what life taught me, even when the lessons weren't part of any curriculum I would have chosen." The next morning, Whitmore and Associates declined to represent the Kazakh mining consortium, a decision that saved their clients from environmental liabilities that would eventually cost similar deals millions of dollars in cleanup and legal fees. The consortium's representatives were disappointed but not surprised. Daniel's reputation for identifying hidden problems in international agreements had apparently begun to spread through certain circles of the business community. Emma's latest painting, completed during a Saturday afternoon art class, showed two figures standing beside a tall building under a sky filled with clouds that somehow managed to look both realistic and hopeful. The figure that clearly represented Daniel was no longer wearing work clothes, but the building still reached toward the sky with the same optimistic determination that had characterized her earlier work. "It's us," she explained when she brought the painting home, though Daniel had already recognized the emotional truth it contained. "But it's also not exactly us, because we're still becoming who we're going to be." At 12 years old, Emma had somehow articulated something that Daniel was still learning to understand about the relationship between identity and circumstance, about how people could change their situations without losing the essential parts of themselves that made them who they were. Sunday evening found Daniel preparing for another week of work that combined intellectual challenge with practical service, of consulting contracts during the day and cleaning offices at night, to of using expertise, gained through academic study and refined through economic necessity to help people navigate a world that was more complex and dangerous than most of them realized. The path from professor to janitor to consultant hadn't been linear or predictable, but it had led to a place where knowledge and circumstance aligned in ways that created value for other people while providing security for the person who mattered most to him. Emma's treatments continued to go well, her artwork continued to evolve, and Daniel had learned to see his various roles not as steps up or down some imaginary ladder, but as different expressions of the same fundamental commitment to using whatever capabilities he possessed in service of whatever purposes mattered most. The last conversation of his evening cleaning shift came from an unlikely source. Carlos, the elevator operator, who had been the first to acknowledge Daniel's changed circumstances, was finishing his own shift when Daniel completed his final rounds. "You know what I learned working nights in this building for 15 years?" Carlos said as they rode the elevator down together toward the lobby. "What's that?" "Most of the important work happens when nobody's watching. The deals they make during the day, they're usually just the visible part of thinking that happened when the building was quiet and people could focus on what actually mattered." Daniel nodded, understanding that Carlos was offering his own perspective on the value of invisible labor and unrecognized expertise. "The thing is," Carlos continued, "you were already doing important work before anybody knew it was important. Taking care of your daughter, keeping the building clean and safe, paying attention to things that other people ignored. The consulting stuff, that's just making the important work more visible." As they reached the lobby and prepared to go their separate ways, Daniel realized that Carlos had offered him a kind of wisdom that wouldn't be found in any academic curriculum or professional development program. The recognition that worth wasn't determined by visibility, and that expertise could develop in unexpected places if people remained open to learning from whatever circumstances life provided. Outside, Manhattan's late-night energy pulsed through streets that never fully slept, full of people whose stories intersected in ways they rarely paused to consider. Daniel walked home through neighborhoods where visible success and hidden struggle existed side by side, where expertise and need combined in countless variations that defied easy categorization. Emma was asleep when he arrived, her latest art project spread across the kitchen table like evidence of dreams that had been translated into color and form. The painting showed a cityscape at night, with lights and windows suggesting the lives and stories contained within buildings that reached toward stars that somehow seemed more accessible than they had any right to be. Looking at his daughter's artwork, Daniel understood that hope wasn't just about believing that circumstances could improve. It was about recognizing that people contained possibilities that weren't always visible on the surface, and that sometimes the most important transformations happened not through dramatic change but through the gradual recognition that what had always been valuable was finally being seen and appreciated by people who mattered. The consulting position at Whitmore and Associates had given him financial security and professional satisfaction, but it had also confirmed something more fundamental about the relationship between knowledge and service, between expertise and humility, between the work that people did and the worth that work represented. Tomorrow would bring new contracts to review, new patterns to identify, new ways to use hard-won knowledge in service of helping other people navigate challenges they couldn't see coming. And tomorrow evening would bring floors to clean, conversations to overhear, and opportunities to remain connected to the building's full ecosystem of visible and invisible contributions. It wasn't the career path Daniel had planned when he'd first entered graduate school with dreams of academic achievement and intellectual recognition. But it was the path that had led him to a place where his expertise could support his daughter's dreams, where his knowledge could prevent other people's disasters, and where his understanding of both privilege and necessity could inform work that mattered in ways that went beyond personal ambition. Standing in their small kitchen, surrounded by Emma's artwork and the quiet satisfaction of another day successfully navigated, Daniel realized that sometimes the best stories weren't about dramatic transformation, but about the gradual recognition that people's worth had been there all along, waiting only for circumstances that allowed it to be seen and valued by those who had the wisdom to look beyond surface assumptions about significance and success.